Hello everyone. Today I'll be introducing the topic of simulation and modeling for digital plant growth representation. So just to introduce some background to the topic, a plant growth simulation is an in silico representation of the development of plant structural and physiological properties through time from simulated variable conditions. And there's many types of applications for this kind of simulation, things like anomaly detection for intervention practices, looking at things like plant environment interactions, and also looking at plant forecasting for things like climate modeling. So how it's important to keep in mind two questions when discussing the scope of a plant simulation. The first is how do we predict the traits of a plant given a simulated environment? And the second is how can we visually represent the structural elements of a plant during its growth? So with those questions in mind, we can describe a plant growth simulation as the combination of two components. The first is the contextual process model, where context is given as environmental parameters or conditions. And given these conditions, we want to develop some model where we can describe the outcome of the plant's observable traits or phenotypes. And these phenotypes are things like the plant height, leaf shape, root architecture, and branching patterns. The second component is the plant representation model, which is a rendering process to interpret the outputs of our contextual model through some sort of visual representation. And usually this is a 2D image or 3D point cloud. So the first thing we'll take a look at is developing a process model using the high throughput plant phenotyping. And the reason why we use this approach is that it's the most prominent method in plant phenomics to extract traits from images using various computer vision methods. And the typical approach to plant growth modeling starts with capturing image or sensor data over time to represent the growth traits of a plant. From there, we can extract meaningful quantitative traits from these data, and these include things like the leaf area, leaf count. And from there, we can model these quantitative traits through some sort of regression modeling. And this can be done usually through a logistical regression. So regression models are quite limited in terms of scope, and they don't provide any generative process for the simulation task. However, it does provide a perspective in terms of the distribution of outcomes of the of various contextual information, and from these we can develop more insightful mechanistic models or even other data-driven process models that have a simulation generative component to them. So next we'll move on to the plant representation models. And as I mentioned before, there's two main types of representations. The first is 2D representation through images, where we take consecutive frames of a plant growth scene, and we can combine them to see the development of plant growth over time as a video. And the second is the 3D representation through point cloud or voxel data. And here we can take a look at more volumetric information and things like occluded structures. So now our task is to try to take our outputs of our process model and try to map it to one of these representations. And this is where the representation model comes in handy. So the first type of representation model is a procedural representation model, where we adapt more of a mechanistic process where we try to map plant traits to the structural elements of a plant. And we typically use some sort of rule-based system. And here we have the most common type is the Lindenmayer system, which is a parameterized rule set based method of describing plant growth. The second approach is a data-driven frame representation model. And this is what I use more so for my own research. And it's more of an image translation task where which is driven by empirical methods for predicting the frames of a plant growth scene. And we try to learn this plant growth from uh, big data sets. And typically, there are two main approaches. There's convolutional recurrent neural networks and conditional generative models. So this is just an introduction to the topic, so I can't go through the details of every single model. However, I can discuss a little bit about the outlooks within the field as it's a growing field of research. So, right, the first thing is 2D to 3D representation through time. There's also trying to incorporate stochastic elements by probabilistic modeling. We're also looking at agent-based systems for plant controls, and also trying to incorporate knowledge systems into the empirical generative approaches. So, thank you very much for listening to this presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to reach me here. So, thank you.